So we are joined by Miss Lindsay Hackett, who is a certified planner and consultant.
Yeah.
I probably butchered that, but to come on today and talk to us about some things related to a city's affordability and other areas. So we're really excited to have you on. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So can you go in just for a few minutes on your background, how you got to the point of being I'm going to call it urban planner, but you can define it differently, and now a consultant. How did that come about? Did you just wake up when you were 5 years old and be like, I want to be a planner? Like, how did that start?
That's a great question. So, actually, when I was younger, I didn't know what I wanted to be. I just knew I would pick from the majors that Texas A&M offered. Aggie family for sure. But I knew that I wanted to help folks that may not have a route to always help themselves.
Okay.
And so I actually went to A&M with a construction science background at first.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I wanted to use that overseas to help develop infrastructure in developing countries.
Interesting.
And I found out because urban planning is a pretty new field.
Oh, okay.
And so it wasn't until it was between my freshman and sophomore year, a friend of mine said, what you're describing sounds like urban planning. And I was like, ooh, what's that? And boy, I switched over and I never looked back. So I did my undergrad and my master's at A&M in urban planning with actually a focus on housing.
Oh, okay.
And then I was able to work locally with the municipalities here in town for 5-6 years. And then just recently during the pandemic, I made the switch to private sector. And so now I have Hackett Planning, LLC, my own little planning firm here in town.
That's awesome. Are you staying pretty busy?
Yeah. Being able to balance out family time and work time, it's been really good.
That's good. So what would you call one of your most interesting projects you've worked on, either in the public sector, like you were talking about before, or even in school? Does one stick out to you as like, I made a difference here?
Oh, man.
I hope that's not gonna put you too much on the spot.
It's such a good question, and it's really hard to isolate the impact that your projects have.
Sure.
There was a project that I worked on in school that was actually called The Power of Play.
Okay.
And it was a project that looked at play equipment for kids, and as the kids played, it operated a generator and used kinetic energy to recharge batteries, and then
that is awesome.
Could create here in the developed world. It could be used to create charging stations and charging portals for folks in like a public space, for example.
Okay.
And the way that technology is utilized overseas in developing countries is that they would use it as playground equipment for the schools, and it would recharge batteries for lanterns.
That's nuts.
And then kids could go home and help with their family's land and anything that they were doing. When the sun went down,
so they had light.
They would have light to do their homework, so their education wasn't impacted.
That's pretty cool.
It was pretty fascinating.
Did you ever get to visit the country or countries you were doing this for, or was it more generally?
No, it was more of a generalized concept of how we could utilize that really well. And so unfortunately it wasn't one that I personally got to see the impact of.
Okay. Well, it's like that with a lot of different things. I know with us at Habitat, same kind of thing. You start the process of doing something for someone, and you don't know where it's going to end up generations from now. But that's a really cool project. Wow.
Thanks.
My head's still thinking about how I wonder if the cities could do this with all their parks that they build. I don't know.
There's some fun ways to incorporate it into parks or public spaces in downtowns or
Awesome. So we wanted to talk to you today. One of the topics that we wanted to make sure we discuss today is something that matters a lot to affordable housing developers, as well as people that live in those communities. And it is this idea of missing middle housing as a tool that impacts affordability as well as, I'm going to make up a word, usability of a neighborhood. So want to hear more about this missing middle thing.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this. So missing middle housing is actually a term that was coined by Dan Paralek in 2010. So it's a relatively recent concept.
Yeah.
And the way that it's defined is it's house scale buildings with multiple units in walkable neighborhoods.
Okay.
And no offense to Mr. Paralek, but I think that's a kind of confusing definition.
A little bit.
What I like to say is that when you think about, you've got a single family detached home all the way up to you have large apartment complex. Mm-hmm. There are so many housing options between those when you think about that range of scale between those. Mm-hmm. And in the mid 1940s, most regulations that were put in place actually made developments like that illegal. Wow. And so a lot of municipalities across the nation just don't have the regulations to even permit housing like this to be developed.
Illegal. Interesting.
Illegal, not in that like someone's going to try and sneak in to build one and you're going to like shut it down kind of thing. It's that the regulations are not in place for you to be able to get a permit.
And to this day, a lot of cities are still like that?
Yeah, it's something that you have to go in and create change and change your policies to allow this type of housing to be constructed again. Because the places that you'll see it is most common in historic neighborhoods. Okay. And so here locally, historic Bryan, so the neighborhood on the other side of Texas Avenue, there's kind of mixed in, there's different housing types. There's a cute little duplex. You'd never know that it was a duplex until you really look at it. There's a cool plex house that has multiple units within it, and they blend right into the neighborhood.
What about, I'm just trying to make sure that I understand, and whoever's listening, what some of these units would look like for missing middle. Would that include, I don't know if anyone's living above it, but in downtown Bryan, you've got Mr. G's Pizza on the corner, and above it, you've got at least one story, maybe two, that looks like at one time it was an apartment. So would that be an example, or am I way off?
No, I think that's pretty close. That's on the higher end of the range. And the range includes things like duplexes, cottage courts or pocket neighborhoods, townhomes, and plex units, so triplexes, fourplexes. And then close to what you're talking about, there's something called a live-work unit, where, you think about, I don't know, we see it in like sitcoms sometimes where we live above our shop and then we walk downstairs to our business.
Man, that's cool.
And, but having this separate, where you have the shops at the bottom and then apartments above is probably just on the other end of the scale or right there at the top end.
See, that's why we bring the expert on to point that out. And so, so it's basically difficult to build from a regulatory standpoint. What is, I think I kind of have an idea of some of the values to the neighborhood, to the city, to the family living in one of these units, what that value is to them. But if you can go into a little more detail on what missing middle accomplishes, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think when we're talking about that, I would want to first define another term.
Sure.
And that's infill development. Okay. And so when you're looking at infill development, you're filling in the holes.
That's easy.
You might have a neighborhood where there's a couple of houses that were torn down a long time ago, and there's just vacant spaces, so you fill it in, infill development.
Got it.
And this type of development is actually a really great option because it capitalizes on existing infrastructure. Okay. And so the portion of a development cost, if you're building a new neighborhood, you're paying for streets, you're paying for water, you're paying for sewer, all of the utilities, all of the infrastructure. And so if you can look at an area where the infrastructure is already in place, then your development will see these cost savings.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
The types of, generally the most common locations, at least that, I've seen, where infill development, these options are most likely to be available, where the infrastructure has been existing for a while, is going to be places that are a little bit closer to a town center. Okay. They're not going to be way out on the edge of town because that's where a lot of the new suburbia type developments are.
Okay.
And so what this ties into, and kind of what I'm getting at here, is walkability. And by looking at an area of town that's closer to amenities, closer to places to eat, places to shop, and that you might be able to even walk to, then you don't necessarily have to plan so intensely for cars.
That's a good point.
And when you don't have to utilize a significant portion of your land for the vehicle, then you have more space for people. And so you might be able to add a couple of units, you might be able to add a little bit more density. And in doing so, you're taking advantage of your existing infrastructure, providing better amenity locations for people, and helping folks save money by not having to buy a car.
Yeah.
And there's just a lot. It's very nuanced. And
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was just thinking when you were saying that my wife and I went on a date recently, and we tried to, obviously, every now and then. And we realized that we just constantly are coming back to downtown Bryan. And it's no offense to, I mean, this community, the whole thing is awesome. It has different flavors. But we were talking and realized, I think we keep coming back to downtown Bryan for the reason you're kind of describing. And it is, we don't have to plan out exactly where we're going to eat. We can park in there and then just walk around and try to see what we're feeling like that day versus having to drive around. And it's just a different feel. So I was pontificating. But okay, so we've got these benefits for missing middle. You haven't mentioned, you touched on it a little bit with infill, I think, but can you expound on what, if any, benefits missing middle type housing has for a municipality? Are there benefits there too?
Yeah, absolutely. So in kind of the development world, there's a little motto or slogan or something that people say, retail follows rooftops.
Right.
And when a retail establishment is trying to decide where to locate, they're looking at the demographics of an area, they're kind of counting heads in a way, and they want to be able to see if there's a market that will support their establishment. Right. And, I'm all in support of, business is business, and, we want to be able to let people do that. And so when you're looking at an area and you're like, well, there's just not enough density for this business to come in, then you're missing out on a potential economic piece that's coming in because they're choosing to go somewhere else where there's enough density to support their business.
So are you thinking of kind of like, if, I hope Walgreens doesn't get mad at me, but if they're thinking about putting another Walgreens, so more of like a corner store type thing, they're going to want to put it in an area where there are enough people to support that. That's basically what you're saying, right?
Right. And so the implications of this are, if you think about, there's a term food deserts, where if you live in a neighborhood and you don't really have easy access to fresh foods, and you might have to get into a car that you may or may not have, and then go a long distance to just go grocery shopping. But if there's an area that's a little bit more dense, then you may be able to have a smaller scale grocery store be located more frequently throughout areas. And it's not really a threat to the H-E-Bs and Walmarts of the world because, everyone loves H-E-B. But is there a way that if someone needs to be able to go get a loaf of bread, get some fruit, be able to have access to these healthier food options, are we creating a built environment that allows for these types of developments to even occur? Right. Okay. And that kind of ties into another term I wanted to throw out.
Go for it.
Which is it's my last one, maybe. Urban design. And I don't know if it's a term so much as just a concept. Okay. And urban design is creating, this is my definition personally, not anyone's special words, but it's creating spaces that feel welcoming to all people at any time of day. And so you think about it, everyone can think of a place where you're like, I wouldn't really go there late at night. Right. But if you have a well-built urban design, safe space, you can also think of spaces that you may have been to in the past. You're like, I know that I would be perfectly safe there if I walked there alone at 1 a.m.
Yeah, right.
And so that is not done on accident. And so most of the time there's concepts and there's goals that can go towards creating a built environment that creates safe spaces for people to have access to these different amenities within their neighborhood. And it's hard to do that without bringing in this kind of gentle density, if you will, that you would get from missing middle housing.
Yeah.
It's hard to do that if your only housing choice is a single family home tucked into a suburban neighborhood or an extremely dense apartment complex. It's just, those don't really match up with that kind of vision that a lot of people can consider for the future.
So let me ask this. I guess you probably studied quite a bit of towns across the world that a lot of them, I know I've been to Europe, and a lot of those towns have a lot of the types of units in different ways than that missing middle kind of thing, what we're missing a lot of. It seems like it's more of an evolution over time rather than, if the rules allow you to, than a all at once, build this stuff. And my question is, do you feel that missing middle housing is something that has to be developed incrementally? Or is it something that you really could rebuild?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And honestly, I might not have said this even yesterday, but I think you can have both.
Okay.
If you are, operating in an existing neighborhood, you're looking at infill development. Infill development specifically is something that will generally occur incrementally over time. And that incremental aspect is actually the best way to also respect the existing tenants and homeowners within that neighborhood. Because if you make that sudden flash pan of development, then you are impacting their, property costs and housing costs and everything. But not to say that you can't bring in this type of housing in greenfield development. So you've got a large, couple acres of land. I have heard of ways that that's been done where the key is to blend your housing types. Okay. Really, any new development can be taking advantage of this, and new developments that can utilize urban design to bring in, different housing type options. Because when you're doing that, you are blending the types of people that you have in a community. And, if you're building this all at once, you're also going to be bringing in, you might have, folks that are working, blue collar jobs. You might have, white collar folks. You may have food service. You may have, upper management of some big company. And studies have shown that it's good for people to be around diverse people. Yeah. And have different, your view of the world can be impacted by empathy of what other people are going through. And you're going to see like, oh, you're having this experience that's different from mine. Let's have a conversation because you're my neighbor. And
that's a really good point.
That is something that I think you can get in greenfield development. You can get that in infill development. It's just bringing in varied housing types and blending them together, I think, is a really good thing for communities.
Yeah, so all this sounds incredibly promising and positive. Doesn't seem like there's much of a downside. Both cities in our community seem to, in different ways, be looking at this concept. But I've also heard that some communities have, not here necessarily, but some communities have had resistance to the idea of, I guess, more from a regulatory standpoint, changing the development rules to allow for this again. Have you heard of cities that are like not super happy about this idea? And what would you tell them to, I guess, think about it again? Or...
I think that's a great question. And honestly, I think the root of people's fears, I think you said it in the question, is change. And if someone comes up to you and says, I'm going to ask you to do something and it's going to be different from what you know, that's
True.
scary. People have fear around that. And I mean, you can't blame them.
Right.
And so I think what I would say to communities like that is be willing to try something and be willing for it to not be perfect. Because, you know, we're human and cities are made up of humans. And when we walk forward through that, if you sit in fear of creating the perfect regulation that will never have any problems, then you're never going to be able to adopt a change.
Right.
You have to move forward knowing that something may need to be updated in the future, or you may have, new information that comes on that can make something better. Yeah. And so one decision's not going to be your end all be all for anything. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I would say that that's true for any policy creation.
That's a really good point. Wow. I've got so many other questions we can get to today. Maybe we can get you on again in the future and talk about some of these others. But did you have anything on this topic that you wanted to bring up before we call it a day?
I think it's been a really great conversation. I think the only other piece that I could throw out is just looking at the housing, who's buying housing right now. You know, millennials are, you know, I am a millennial, and we've been notoriously desperate for being able to purchase homes because of the avocado toast issue.
Yeah, it's a problem.
But one of the items that Dan Paralek, so he's the guy who coined that missing middle housing term, he is involved with the Strong Towns group, and one statistic that he put forward was 60% of millennials are looking for homes that have walkable living and missing middle housing. And so we don't want to write off an entire generation of people that are looking for homes. That's true. You know, if cities want to be able to take advantage of this market, and if developers want to be able to build something that there's clearly demand for, then it's something to consider.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, it's been a lot of fun, Lindsay. Again, we'll have to get you back on the show.
I love it.
But yeah, this has been Lindsay Hackett talking to us about missing middle housing. Thanks so much.
Thank you.